Hi everyone. This video is the first part of a two-part lecture dealing with the trade-offs plant species make and how those trade-offs combine to determine species life history strategies. Let's start by talking about fitness, since this is one of the ways of thinking about or even quantifying how successful an individual plant is. So strictly speaking, we'd say that fitness is how successful an individual plant is at transmitting its genes to the next generation. In other words, how many successful offspring it produces. We could also word this as fitness is the advantage of one genotype, in other words a set of genes, that has over other genotypes, where success is defined as whether the relative abundance of that genotype increases or decreases in the next generation. Now, much of what we'll be talking about today is dealing with how plants maximize their fitness. In other words, what strategies a plant follows to try and have the greatest number of descendants. If you want to say this in human terms, we'd say we're thinking here about the choices that you would make to end up with the largest number of successful children. Okay, so then how do plants maximize their fitness? Well, the starting point is that plants have a finite amount of time, energy, and resources, and they have to split these three among three broad functions: survival, also called maintenance, growth, and reproduction. Plants then differ in how they balance these different requirements. In other words, how they trade off one function against another, with the idea being that if they allocate their resources to one function, it's unavailable for another, and that they want to balance these requirements to maximize their fitness. Now, if you're struggling a bit with understanding this, let's try put it in human terms. So, let's then think about the trade-offs that you personally make. You have a limited amount of time, energy, and resources, and you have to divide these between sleep, work, and fun, and of course there may be other categories also. And you want to do this in a way that will ensure you complete your degree. But the trick here, and you guys know this, is that you can't spend all day working, or all day sleeping, or all day having fun. You need to balance these carefully, since time and energy and resources spent on one function are not available for other functions. So you have to trade off carefully how you use and how you allocate your time, energy, and resources to the different functions that you need to perform and that you want to perform. So, let's look at two co-occurring species that are common here in the Magaliesberg and that have very different characteristics. And let's think about the trade-offs these species exhibit. So, Commelina africana is a short forb. It's fast-growing and has a relatively short lifespan. On the other hand, Ochna pulchra is a slow-growing and long-lived tree. So you can see that these two species have access to the same basic resources in the same environment, but have used those resources in very different ways. If we just focus on reproduction, for example, we can see that Commelina has the strategy to flower during its first growing season, but Ochna requires multiple years of growth before it can flower for the first time. So these two species are making lots of different trade-offs. Okay, but the simplest way to observe trade-offs is to quantify differences in resource allocation. When resources are allocated to one function or one purpose, they are then not available for other functions. This is the reason that one way to define a trade-off is actually that a trade-off is occurring when there's a negative correlation between any two life history traits. So for example, thinking about Commelina and Ochna, we could say that relative to Ochna, Commelina trades off fast growth against plant strength and structural investment. In other words, Commelina is growing faster, but at the cost of not investing in plant structural compounds. And therefore it's a weak plant that can't stand by itself. It kind of crawls along the ground. Some other examples of common trade-offs would be trading off growth versus reproduction, or seed size versus seed number. And we'll look at two examples in the next slides in detail. But I want to first raise 2 points. First, remember that all species are making many trade-offs at the same time. And we are just thinking about pairwise trade-offs, in other words, relationships between a pair of traits like seed size and seed number. We're thinking about these pairwise trade-offs for simplicity for now. Second, we need to actually think what is the simplest way for us to actually measure differences in resource allocation. Okay, so practically, we can measure resource allocation by looking at biomass allocation. In other words, by looking at which plant parts are the largest, or at least have the highest biomass, we have an indication of where plants are investing their resources. Now, this can be organ-focused. So, for example, we could look at the biomass of roots versus shoots versus stems. And indeed, on the right of your slide in the image, you can see the mean biomass allocation at high versus low altitudes in alpine plant species. You can see, for example, how at higher altitudes, a much larger proportion of biomass is invested in roots than at low altitudes. And this trade-off comes at the cost of stems, where there's a lot less invested in stems at high altitudes than at low altitudes. We could equally split biomass allocation by function. So, for example, we could split how much biomass is used for defending the plant versus providing structural support versus photosynthesis versus reproduction. Now, the first example of a trade-off we're going to consider deals with fecundity schedules. In other words, when is the first time a plant reproduces, and then how many times does a plant reproduce? Now, there are two strategies here. The first is semelparous plants, also called monocarpic, and that gives you a clue because mono means one. These are plants that reproduce only once and then die. The second strategy is shown by iteroparous or polycarpic plants. Again, poly meaning many, and carpic meaning fruit. These are species that reproduce many times during their life cycles. So this then is a trade-off between immediate reproduction versus continued growth, maintenance, and reproduction. Maybe it's because we're an iteroparous species, but to me I always think that semelparity sounds like a really weird strategy. So let's think about how semelparity can actually maximize plant fitness, despite it only allowing plants to reproduce once. Good. So let's then think this through with a simple example. Let's start with a population of 25 individuals of a semelparous species. And let's assume that each plant invests all of its resources into reproduction at the end of the first growing season, producing an average of 10 seeds per plant. That gives us a total seed output of 250 seeds from those 25 individuals, which then die after reproducing. So their total final seed output is 250 seeds. Let's then imagine an iteroparous species that also starts with 25 individuals. It has a 50% mortality rate per year. Now, because this species is allocating resources to growth, survival, and reproduction, it's only able to produce an average of 4 seeds per plant at the end of each growing season. Only half of those original 25 plants then survive to the next year, and each of them will again produce 4 seeds. Half of those individuals will survive to the next year, and again each of them will produce 4 seeds, and so it continues. What we see is at the end, once all of those original 25 individuals have died, that population produced 200 seeds. So under this scenario, semal parity gives us more seeds than iteroparity. However, let's now imagine another scenario with only one small difference. Again, we have an iteroporous species that starts with 25 individuals, but the mortality rate is now slightly lower at 30%. And if we follow this through with those 25 individuals each producing 4 seeds, 30% of them dying off, the remaining surviving individuals each producing 4 seeds in the next year, and then 70% of those surviving and producing 4 seeds in the next year, and so on, and so on, we end up with a final seed output of over 300 seeds. So here, in this scenario, we see iteroparity is going to maximize fitness. Therefore, what we see is that whether an environment favors semal parity or iteroparity can depend on adult survival rate. Specifically, we'd say that semal parity is favored by a high adult mortality rate. It's like the plants are saying, why bother trying to stay alive if you're very likely to die, right? Rather just invest everything in reproduction now and don't waste anything in survival or growth, because there's only a small chance of surviving. So remember that high adult mortality, at least relative to seedling mortality, favors semal parity. But there are at least other 2 factors, in addition to high adult mortality, that can favor semal parity. The first of these is frequent disturbances. Under frequent disturbances, we expect to see many short-lived semal-porous species. So these would include all annual species, and it's worth remembering that many of our commercial grains are actually annual species. Now, under frequent disturbances, we expect that habitat suitability is going to change really quickly, because these are early successional habitats, and they're going to develop into later successional habitats very quickly. Therefore, as time progresses, there's an increasing chance that conditions that are favorable for a species now will become unfavorable. Therefore, the plant should rather invest its energy in reproducing now than instead of waiting when the conditions might become unfavorable for it and then reproducing later. The other driver of semal parity can be low productivity. And in areas of low productivity, think for example of deserts, we see some long-lived semal-porous species. There are not many perennial species that are semal-porous. Probably the most famous would be bamboo, some of which only will reproduce after more than 100 years and then die immediately. Now, being a semal-porous species in a low productivity environment is beneficial because it allows individuals to accumulate resources for a long period and then to use them once off. Now, this is typically associated with conditions where there's a high cost for reproductive activity. So, for example, imagine in a desert where there are not very many pollinators. If a plant produces 1 flower per year, that single flower is unlikely to attract a lot of pollinators. However, if the plant accumulates resources for 100 years and produces 100 flowers at once, then it's going to be much more likely to attract pollinators and to successfully reproduce. A different example would be where reproduction depends on the production of an expensive inflorescence stalk. So a classic example here is the yucca plant of the North American deserts. You can see it has a massively long inflorescence stalk. If that plant produced flowers every year, it would only have enough resources to produce a short stalk, which means that those flowers wouldn't be as visible or as exposed to its pollinators. So again, by accumulating resources over a long period, the species is able to invest all of those resources in one reproductive event which is then far more efficient than many small reproductive events. Here in the Magaliesberg, just to show you an example of a Semmelparis species that you've maybe encountered during fieldwork, several of the Kalanchoe species, these succulent species with very waxy leaves, they're Semmelparis species, and again you can see they also invest a lot of energy into producing a tall flower stalk that attracts pollinators, and I think also probably helps disperse seeds further distances. The second trade-off example that I want to share with you is the trade-off that plants make between investing in large numbers of seeds versus large seed sizes. So a plant can decide to produce many small seeds or a few large seeds, and there are benefits to both. Large seeds are associated with improved seedling establishment. This is because those seeds have got extra resources, so they can withstand unfavorable conditions after germination for longer. It's like they've got a full tank of fuel that they can burn through, waiting for conditions to get better. This, of course, requires a lot of resources to be given to each seed, and the trade-off then is that not so many seeds can be produced. On the other hand, small seeds are really cheap to produce, so a massive number can be produced, and they also tend to be easily dispersed, although obviously a plant could also invest in dispersal structures if it wanted. However, these small seeds are only able to establish in suitable conditions. So there's a low chance that one individual seed will find suitable conditions, but because so many seeds are produced, the total or the final chance of one of those seeds arriving in suitable conditions can be quite high. So just as an example, in the bottom of the slide you can see the large fruits of clivias, which contain very large seeds, but only a few, versus the seeds of the dandelion, which are incredibly small, and there are many, many hundreds produced per flower. So, an important question we should ask is, when do plants invest in seed size rather than seed abundance, and vice versa? So, it might be worth pausing this video for a second and thinking about this for yourself. But under what conditions do you think seed size would be favored, in other words, large seeds, versus seed abundance? Okay, in competitive or stressful environments, we know that establishment is going to be difficult. If it's competitive, the plant will have to fight for resources. If it's a stressful environment, the plant is going to have to survive long enough to establish a good root system or enough leaves above ground to access resources. Therefore, in these environments, large seeds will give the plant a better chance of reproducing because of those resource reserves that let it survive until conditions get better or until it becomes more competitive. In contrast, in disturbed environments, establishment is typically easy because there's not a lot of competition, because the disturbance has removed other plants, but mortality is high. Therefore, producing a large number of seeds is generally a better strategy to ensure successful offspring, because at least some of those many individuals are going to disperse to a really suitable habitat and be able to establish there. Now, one of the other scenarios is, of course, an unpredictable environment. For example, maybe an area where rainfall varies massively from year to year, and we could think, for example, of the Nama Karoo. Here we find that plants actually sometimes cheat a little bit, and they have multiple strategies within a single species, and this is called bet hedging. And a good example of bet hedging is heterocarpy. Okay, and again we can dissect that word: hetero meaning different and carpy meaning fruit. And indeed, heterocarpy refers to a plant that's able to produce more than one type of seed. So for example, you can see this daisy here in the picture. in one of those inflorescences, it'll actually produce 3 different types of seeds. These seeds differ in their germination behavior, they differ in their dispersal ability, and they even differ in the size and number that are produced. And just to illustrate, seed type A here is light, it's good for dispersal, many are produced, and seed type C on the other hand is heavy, so it's really not going to disperse very far, and a lot of resources are invested in it, and not many are produced. This one will germinate immediately. This one will go into dormancy. So if there is unpredictable rainfall and it doesn't rain, seed type C is the type that will allow the species to survive until rain comes, and seed type A is the type of seed that will allow it to reproduce quickly when conditions are good. There are, of course, many other factors that also affect seed size and abundance. So even if a plant has a lot of resources, it might not always produce the biggest seeds or the most seeds. And this is kind of the deviation from the pairwise trade-offs that I mentioned earlier. So just as an example, even if a plant is able to produce larger seeds, smaller seeds might be a benefit in an area where there are many granivores, in other words, many animals that are eating seeds, because they target large seeds. The plant might also not produce very large seeds because its dispersal agent, in other words, for example, the bird that disperses it, might be limited by the size of seeds that it can ingest. We also see things like the timing of fertilization can matter for how large seeds are produced. So it might not always be a straightforward seed size, seed abundance trade-off. Especially if there's late fertilization, then the seed doesn't have enough time to grow before the end of the season. Other environmental factors can also play a role, and there can even be genetic differences within species. So here I'm providing 2 examples of life history trade-offs. Why don't you pause this video and think for a moment about what trade-off is being exhibited in each case. So I'll give you a second to think about that. In panel A, what we see is the trade-off between seed size and seed abundance. You can see the number of seeds has been standardized by basal area. And you can see here, we've got the size measured as the weight. And what do we see across different populations of goldenrod, the solidagos? We see this negative correlation indicating a trade-off. In panel B, we see a trade-off between reproduction and growth, with number of cones per tree representing reproduction, and the width of the annual rings telling us how much the tree stem grew. Okay, we'll pick this up next time by thinking about how life history strategy is comprised of all of the different trade-offs that species make.